It's a privilege to welcome you all back to the University of Chicago campus, and I'm eager to hear your reflections on these rich themes of technology, faith, and gratitude. Matthew Crawford studied physics at UC Santa Barbara and then turned to political philosophy, earning a PhD from the University of Chicago. He has published articles on ancient Greek philosophy, neuroscience, and the philosophy of science. He's the author of Why We Drive, Toward a Philosophy of the Open Road, published in 2020, The World Beyond Your Head on Becoming an Individual in an Age of Distraction, published in 2015, and Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work, published in 2009, a New York Times bestseller that has been translated into 7 languages. Mark Shiffman is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Director at the Institute for Philosophy, Technology, and Politics at St. Patrick's Seminary and University of the Archdiocese of San Francisco. He's the translator of Aristotle's De Anima, published with Hackett in 2010. His scholarly studies span the fields of ancient philosophy, political theory, and the Catholic tradition, and his writings have appeared in Communio, Commonweal, First Things, Public Discourse, and New Polity, and on Front Porch Republic. Dr. Melanie Barrett is Professor of Moral Theology at the University of St. Mary of the Lake, also called Mundelein Seminary, a graduate Catholic diocesan seminary located in Mundelein, Illinois. She holds 2 doctorates, a PhD in religious ethics from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and an STD in moral theology from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. She also holds an STL in dogmatic theology. She teaches courses on Catholic social doctrine, the ethics of sex, marriage, and family, virtue theory, and philosophical ethics. She is a member of the Society of Christian Ethics, the Catholic Theological Society of America, and the Academy of Catholic Theology. Currently, she is completing a book on suffering and the moral life and the theology of Thomas Aquinas. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Matthew Crawford to offer his opening remarks.
Thanks for the intro, and thanks for the invitation. I haven't been in this room for a long time. I have one vivid memory. I think Mark was there, actually. We were both taking a seminar on Plato's Symposium with Leon Cass. It was a wonderful class. But someone got the idea that we should do a dramatic reading of the dialogue. And Rachel Zuckert, who was organizing this, probably out of some sense of mischief, asked me to be the flute girl. I don't know if there is a flute girl, very minor role. And me, out of stupidity, I guess, agreed. So, yeah, it was an awkward night. Well, the wine did flow, so that helped. The remarks are... That's right, you were Agathon. Yeah, main character, one of the main characters. Well, not the main character. The remarks I prepared were way too long for the time and what I shared with Melanie and Mark. So I've just been slashing. So if I stumble at points, I hope you'll forgive me, because it's a lot of cutting going on here. So when I refer to the technological attitude, that means something like the idea that there's no mystery in nature that can escape our comprehension, and so everything lies open to manipulation, something like that. In his book Introduction to Christianity, Ratzinger traces the road taken by the human spirit over the last millennium and 2 decisive inflection points by which we got to the present. By historicizing the technological attitude, Ratzinger enables us to see it as something that has a beginning point behind which one can go, the better to get a critical view of our own metaphysics. Like Strauss, Ratzinger points to the Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico as the first to formulate, in a piece of bold anticipation, the new concept of reality and truth that marks the arrival of the modern. Vico puts it in a formula consisting of a mere 3 words in Latin, virum quia factum. That is to say, all that we can truly know is what we have made ourselves. Vico begins by following Aristotle and the idea that to know something fully is to know its cause. But from this old thought, something completely new is deduced. If I am the cause of something because I made it, then I can know it fully. Ratzinger writes, "Man did not produce the cosmos, and his bottommost depths remain opaque to him. Complete demonstrable knowledge is attainable only within the bounds of mathematics, an activity of the human mind, and in the field of history, which is the realm of man's own activities and can therefore be known by him." He's articulating sort of the modern position and what's kind of a first wave of modernity for him, you could say. There's a second wave that for Ratzinger begins with Marx. I'm going to skip a bunch, but the idea here is that truth is no longer identified with what man has already made, as in Vico's formula, but what it is feasible to do going forward. So philosophy becomes a kind of activism. There's no possibility of repose in a stable world, even one that's man-made and should therefore be intelligible on Vico's grounds. The formula coined by Ratzinger for this newer dispensation, and so he's riffing on Vico, is verum quia faciendum. If I remember my Latin grammar correctly, faciendum is the gerundive, which carries a hint of the imperative mood. So this formula identifies truth with what is to be done. The feasible here appears under the sign of an obligation of sorts. I'm reminded of a saying of Robert Oppenheimer. When asked why he would create such a terrible weapon of mass destruction, he's said to have answered, "When you see something that is technically sweet, you do it." I always thought of this as a psychological statement about the intellectual pleasures of problem solving, and how such pleasures, internal to some technical practice, can short-circuit a reflection on the goodness of the end served by the practice. I still think that's true, but Ratzinger shows that the compulsive character of technology is tied as well to an epistemic quandary that Western man takes himself to be in, rooted in skepticism about our access to being. It's a quandary he got himself into by the successive steps that Ratzinger lays out. He writes, "So the conviction was bound to spread that man could really know, all man could really know was what was repeatable, what he could put before his eyes at any time in an experiment. This is a standpoint that signifies devotion to reality insofar as it is capable of being shaped." So we've gone from the made to the makeable. Again, some skipping. So Ratzinger has shown a trajectory in which we turned in our basic orientation from the world made by God, sort of the object of contemplation of ancient or medieval philosophy, to what has been made by man, to what it is feasible to do going forward, with man himself as something to be shaped according to the rationalist dreams of whoever holds power. He then shows us that outside of this dynamic of the made and the makeable, there is available to us an entirely different orientation to reality, what he calls belief. When a man says credo, I believe, and here I quote, he's not primarily enunciating a program for changing the world or simply attaching himself to a chain of historical events. The act of believing does not belong to the relationship know-make, which is typical of the intellectual context of makeability thinking, but is much better expressed in the quite different relationship stand-understand. Belief here is not an incomplete or provisional form of knowledge, the kind of thing that in principle could one day be verified or refuted. Instead, it's something you do in the present, a kind of loyalty. Ratzinger would have us simply step aside from the epistemological anxiety that's driven the great drama of modern thought. But unlike other, I would say, vulgar forms of existentialism, he doesn't offer as a remedy for such anxiety a cult of the will. He's not suggesting one make a heroic decision to believe, which, after all, would be an incoherent thing. Imagine someone who comes into a room and announces, "There's not a cloud in the sky outside, but I believe it's raining," hoping we will admire him as a man of conviction. For Ratzinger, belief is not an act of will, but a response to something received. So now I want to talk about receiving as distinguished from making, because I think the basic orientation to the world that we call technology is one that deprives us of something necessary for our happiness, and that is gratitude. We feel gratitude when someone does something for us outside the realm of exchange. One wants to market this arrival of something that overflows what is expected and recognize the source of it. In acting outside necessity, our benefactor shines. Or one may feel gratitude without a counterparty to receive it, in response to some fortunate condition that could have been otherwise, having good health, or good looks, for example, life itself, something for which we are not responsible, a gift. Whether in response to good fortune or to some identifiable benefactor, in taking note of this gift, one feels that one has regained a proper coordinate system. It's a calm feeling. One shucks off that irritable, constant background sense of not receiving one's due, the sense of a self inflated beyond its true proportions. For it does feel like a little dose of truth, this moment of reorientation. Seeing oneself from the outside as one who receives rather than demands is also liberating from resentment, entitlement, grievance. You feel lighter as well as smaller, and more ready to act with grace toward others, that is, to be larger. For grace and gratitude have the same root, whether one speaking etymologically or psychologically. I think our condition as modern people makes the experience of gratitude especially elusive. So when we feel grateful, it has an effect that's all the more powerful, bumping us out of a deep spiritual rut. I think that's because it's an experience that's hard to make sense of in a way that accords with the grand metaphysical picture that we live within most of the time. If we can understand why this is so, it'll give us a critical vantage point from which to view our historical moment. It may also help us to identify the source of our sourness and point the way towards something better. Most simply, gratitude requires that there be an other, an outside world that is not under one's control and not of one's own making. Now, of course, it's simply the case that there is such a world, but there are different ways of responding to this fact. The English philosopher Michael Oakeshott wrote 2 essays which, if you put them side by side, offer a contrast between 2 personality types. One he called the rationalist, and the other he called the conservative. Now here, conservative doesn't refer to a political ideology. Instead, it names a disposition. What distinguishes the conservative is not hankering after the past, but rather affection for the present, for what actually exists. He has an eye for all the ways his surroundings afford a good life, or provide materials for the building of such a life. He wants to preserve the present world, not out of fearful, small-minded rejection of the possible, but because he has a greater awareness of the resources of the actual, which may be lost if we're not careful. In other words, he feels gratitude for the world and a sense of obligation to it. The rationalist, by contrast, looks at the world and is offended by the waste, the inefficiency, the chaos, the suffering, the grotesque failures of optimization. It wants to set it right. He has a vision of a better world, and that's where he lives, in devotion to his vision. Probably you need both types to have a healthy society. But in the present order, one of these types is full of confidence and speaks well into a microphone, while the other is apologetic and defensive. One has the wind of history at his back and is well capitalized. The other sometimes doubts his own sanity. Our own time has seen the emergence of a third type, the transhumanist, who's maybe just an over-the-top caricature of the rationalist. And like most caricatures, it brings into relief the defining features of the original through exaggeration. So here's a quote from a prominent transhumanist who is speaking to Paul Kingsnorth. This is off of YouTube. He says, "I'd like to bring your attention to the issue with nature and biology that transhumanists have, that is fundamentally flawed and likely even immoral to perpetuate, given its tendency to predation, disease, and death. Simply said, all nature and biology, from plants to wildlife to people, are something to be overcome and totally replaced with the synthetic. No one with even the slightest bit of compassion would ever create a world like ours, filled with so much suffering. It must all be undone and remade with technology, justice, and equality." So clearly there's a theological point at issue here. It's not clear to me if this transhumanist is saying that there is a creator and he's a real bastard, or there's no creator and nature itself is a real bastard. In any case, the so-called created order is no order at all, but a filthy and cruel chaos. He says it would be immoral to perpetuate. So, the transhumanist speaks as a moralist. He appears to be animated by what Nietzsche called ressentiment, the opposite of gratitude. In the Gnostic heresy, the world was created not by God, but by his evil twin, roughly. It must be rejected and overcome through human effort. Doing so requires special knowledge, gnosis, which is to be cultivated in a priestly class. This finds its equivalent in today's technocratic managers and moral visionaries of equality, aflame with a vision of life beyond suffering that will arrive when the givens of life are totally replaced with the synthetic, as our transhumanists put it. The point is to bring about salvation here in this world, Vogelin's famous immanentizing the eschaton. As many have noted, the transsexual ideology is a version of transhumanism, pungently named by Mary Harrington as meat-Lego Gnosticism. From the beginning of the modern rationalist project, the body has been the thorn in the side of it. The creative freedom of the will is compromised by its entanglement with a body subject to natural necessities not of one's choosing. But if we can reconceive the body as raw material, as meat Legos, and make man himself a technological project, then we can escape this subjugation to necessities that impinge from outside the will. But you don't have to look to the exotic fringe of transhumanism to see this. The whole movement of the present is to bring the world under rational control. For example, substituting algorithms and mechanized certainties for the frailties of human judgment, as for example in the push for driverless cars, or replacing the unclean clamor of democratic politics with expert administration. We may even take up this approach in relation to ourselves. For example, when we seek to eliminate the element of chance and serendipity in love through dating apps that optimize through personalized search criteria. This isn't quite the madness of Eros, the divine folly. a consuming flame one's cast into by the god despite oneself, to be magnificently destroyed at the feet of one's beloved, giving thanks all the while from a heart that is glad. Compared to that, life on the dating apps looks like a half-life of prudish solipsism, however many orgasms it may yield. A life fully under control is a life of solitude, from which the possibility of serendipity has been excluded. Serendipity is perhaps the secular name for grace. The push for rational control has been with us for some centuries, but has lately entered an especially frantic phase, and a jealous determination to leave no area of life untouched by this libido dominandi. Indeed, to trust in fate, or divine providence, or fortuna, is to be downright irresponsible. It's not safe, for one thing. There's a fearful timidity to the rationalist soul. I think we can connect this timidity to ressentiment against the created order and its author. The basic idea of ressentiment is captured in Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes. Driven by hunger, a fox tried to reach some grapes hanging high on the vine, but was unable to, although he leaped with all his might. As he walked away, the fox remarked, "Oh, you aren't even ripe yet. I don't need any sour grapes." To indulge in ressentiment is to deny that something is good, which is one way of responding to one's own impotence to achieve it. Instead of accepting one's limitations and preserving one's admiration for what cannot be achieved, one's vain smallness of soul leads one to tear down what is high, placing oneself above it. Notice that this is the opposite of becoming large by first becoming small, as in the connection I trace between grace and gratitude. Ressentiment instead turns the objective order of value upside down. One variation on this is the insistence that all values are merely subjective anyway. There's nothing truly higher that stands in judgment of my own character and capacities. This is to collapse the vertical dimension of reality, in the hope of closing what I've taken to calling the erotic gap. Gratitude is important not merely because it makes us more psychologically healthy, but because, I believe, it reflects a more adequate understanding of man's true situation. Those grapes are really there. They really are sweet. It's natural that we should strive for them, and natural that we should fall short. The man or woman of vitality takes pleasure in each thing being what it truly is. This is what it means to live in the erotic gap. Thus lived, the stinging awareness of our imperfection does not lead us to falsify the world. Just now I mentioned the man or woman of vitality. I mean a person with a quality very different from the one I earlier called the timidity of the rationalist soul. So let me say just a few words about vitalism. Historically, vitalism has been a philosophical idiom in which some kind of freedom is asserted, as against deterministic accounts of human being and reductive accounts of nature. Politically, is marked by skepticism toward the material and institutional powers that assert their authority under the banner of progress. These long ago coalesced into a technoculture within which some basic questions about nature and human being have been not answered, but rather forgotten, kept at bay with harumphing, or declared obsolete by the progress of knowledge. And there's actually a resurgence of vitalism on the online right that some of you may have noticed. I think Ratzinger points the way to so the current vitalism is just kind of just rebellious in spirit, but I think Ratzinger points the way toward a more adequate kind of vitalism that would have to take into account or have to offer a kind of metaphysics of nature. He does that both by his critical genealogy of the technological mindset and by the positive account he gives of receiving the world as against making it. I think this alternative disposition supports what's best in the human spirit, and I want to explore this hunch by relating a personal experience. It's 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and sweat is dripping down my back. My goggles are steamed up, and it's hard to see. I'm on a tract of land owned by the railroad, a wooded area in Richmond, Virginia, with discarded beer cans and the occasional homeless encampment commonly referred to as behind the Martins. Riding a dirt bike on a narrow, meandering trail that is rocky and muddy, with protruding roots and fallen limbs, creek crossings, steep descents, and tight switchbacks, at a mere 15 miles per hour, I might be taxed to the very limit of my mental ability. Picking lines, making imperceptible decisions of throttle, clutch, steering, braking, and body English, revising them on the fly as surprises arrive at my front wheel, all of this demands total concentration. When I push the pace beyond my current level of confidence in response to some challenge of the terrain, it's a kind of leap of faith. Or maybe it's a query. I can't say to what entity this question is addressed. Myself? The obscurities of the trail? A loving providence? It's a position of utter exposure to contingency. Let's see how things go. If it goes well over the following seconds, meaning without mishap, maybe even with a glimmer of some new finesse, this faith redeemed is the sweetest vindication I know of. For a moment, I feel existentially justified. I feel less like a worm and more like that other thing, the thing I have a constant nagging sense that I ought to be. In pursuit of this feeling, I once took 4 trips to the emergency room over the course of 12 months. 2 broken ribs, a broken heel, what I thought was a separated tendon, it was a muscle strain, and a case of heat stroke. And this must have been about a dozen years ago, so I was like 47. In other words, I'm too old for this kind of crap. The feeling of exposure one has on a dirt bike recalls one to a basic truth. We're fragile, embodied beings. There's a certain risk that's inherent in moving around by whatever means. A responsible person does everything he can to minimize this risk. Yet is risk somehow bound up with humanizing possibilities? Here we're getting into kind of a vitalist theme. The Dutch historian Johan Ratzinger found the origins of civilization to lie in play. He wrote, to dare, to take risks, to bear uncertainty, to endure tension. These are the essence of the play spirit. Let's place that thought beside another. Ratzinger points out that the Hebrew word amen has a rich variety of meanings. They include truth, firmness, firm ground, also loyalty, to trust, entrust oneself, take one's stand on something, believe in something. He writes that the amen is a trustful placing of myself on the ground that upholds me, not because I've made it and checked it with my own calculations, but rather precisely because I've not made it and cannot check it. It expresses the abandonment of oneself to what we can neither make nor need to make, to the ground of the world as meaning. Is there then something bold and life-affirming in faith, as there is in play? This trustful placing of myself on the ground that upholds me would seem to be a kind of existential courage. Maybe that's why people of easy and resolute religious faith seem light-hearted, as the courageous do. To trust in providence relieves one of anxiety for the future. To believe that the fundamental ontology of the world, being itself, is somehow trustworthy would seem to be something further in the same direction. It relieves one of anxiety for the present. That is real abandon. A person in that state is in a possession of a gift, and he shines. I suppose this is what charisma means. It's from the Greek word for grace. When I've pressed my luck on the trail, heedlessly as it were, and that fleeting glimmer happens, it does feel like a shining state of grace. It's heedless of hazard, but also heeding a call of some kind. Can it be accessed more reliably, this courage that makes one outrageously, luxuriously free? Ratzinger writes, "What is belief, really?" So I want to close with a few lines from his introduction to Christianity. To believe as a Christian means, in fact, entrusting oneself to the meaning that upholds me and the world, taking it as the firm ground on which I can stand fearlessly. It means affirming that the meaning we do not make, but can only receive, is already granted to us, so that we have only to take it and entrust ourselves to it. Christian faith lives on the discovery that not only is there such a thing as objective meaning, but that this meaning knows me and loves me. Thank you.
Thanks to the Living Christian Institute and the Committee on Social Thought. And I just want to say it's nice to be back in this room. When I was a graduate student in the Committee on Social Thought, I was for a while the organizer of the Social Thought Colloquium in this room. So I got used to hosting other speakers here, and it's nice to be hosted in the same place. My remarks revolve around the distinction between optimism and hope. In one of the bits that Matt cut out of the remarks that he sent to us, he dares to get into metaphysics a little bit, into the question of being, and in fact the relationship between being and goodness, and this relationship, this often overlooked connection between the intellectual metaphysical order and the practical psychological order, I think, is important. This connection between being and goodness is a relationship that we either recognize as a deep and real connection, or that we assume is some kind of bifurcation, which is the typical modern way of taking it. Whatever that connection is, we often think it and feel it implicitly. It's reflected in our attitude toward living and being and acting in the world in ways that Matthew has invoked. And I think it's entirely correct to locate this question at the heart of the fundamental differences between the Platonic Aristotelian tradition that's developed in pre-modern Christian thought and most of what we consider to be distinctly and insistently modern in opposition to that tradition. I would say this is also the problem, the relationship between being and goodness, at the heart of what we call nihilism, which really amounts to the denial of the goodness of being. And in this respect, I'm just going to posit that both Nietzsche and Heidegger are mistaken when they trace nihilism back to Greek thought and metaphysics. But that's a longer argument, but I am going to approach that point in a somewhat indirect way. So I want to extend Matt's reflections along the lines of another theological virtue, namely hope. And I want to do this by differentiating hope from optimism. Optimism, I argue, is both a distinctly modern disposition and a nihilistic one. A good place to start is Matt's Oakeshottian description of the conservative disposition as one that sees the world through the lens of cherishing the good the good that actually is and should be preserved, rather than through resenting what is in favor of what is not yet. The technocratic disposition seeks to dismantle or wipe away what is for the sake of what one can project in imagination as a smoother and more standardized organization of things. It is a nihilistic habit precisely because it denies the goodness of being, both in its basic disposition and in the practical consequences that flow from it. In our time, particularly in America, optimism has become both a kind of moral imperative and a kind of psychological addiction. The addiction was fairly straightforwardly embraced and then promulgated as a moral imperative by most of the boomer generation, both in its liberationist form and in its libertarian form. This straightforwardness, kind of naive embrace of the addiction to optimism, has had the floor drop out from under it, it seems, since 2008, which is the year both of the financial crisis and of the first book of the Hunger Games. This does not mean that the addiction or the imperative disappear, but only that the need for optimism has become more fraught and more anxious, generating a need for some kind of compensation. For example, by embracing technological accelerationism, or for some angry discharge of the fraught tension by identifying the responsible enemy, an enemy either visible in the political sphere or conjured by the conspiratorial imagination, or quite often a combination of the two. I think this goes a long way to account for the very different psychology of millennials and Gen Z, broadly speaking, and more generally an American atmosphere in our time, that combines in varying proportions a kind of burn-it-all-down cynicism and a need and a utopian passion, whether that's progressive or nostalgic utopianism, a passion that dispenses entirely with any felt need for articulating a persuasive practical vision. In terms of the profiles of their political psychology, I would suggest that MAGA is a very dark and fantastical kind of Reaganism, and woke is a very dark and unimaginative kind of progressivism. Let's call them optimism gone dark, or a dark side of optimism in which its nihilistic undertones come more to the surface. And now for what it's worth, rather than expanding on those suggestions, which I'm sure people will be interested in taking up in the Q&A, I'm going to sketch out a brief genealogy of this political psychology, drawing on the same resource as Matthew, which in some respects is a genealogy of modernity itself. Like Joseph Ratzinger, who, as Pope Benedict, authored the encyclical Spe Salvi, I'll begin the story with Francis Bacon. Bacon famously proposes that knowledge is power and that its proper application is for providing the relief of man's estate, which is already, sort of negative and resentful. It is this application of technoscientific knowledge to alleviating the pressures of human existence that Bacon describes as charity. This new version of charity is tethered to new versions of faith and hope. To quote Spe Salvi, "The novelty, according to Bacon's vision, lies in a new correlation between science and praxis. This is also given a theological application. The new correlation between science and praxis would mean that the dominion over creation, given to man by God and lost through original sin, would be reestablished. Now this redemption, the restoration of the lost paradise," and this is all Baconian language that he's drawing on, "is no longer expected from faith, but from the newly discovered link between science and praxis. This programmatic vision has determined the trajectory of modern times, and it also shapes the present-day crisis of faith, which is essentially a crisis of Christian hope. This hope, too, in Bacon, acquires a new form. Now it is called faith in progress. End quote. To better understand the moral and political psychology of this transformation, it's helpful to consider the psychology of hope itself. Aquinas approaches this psychology through the scholastic appropriation of Plato's three-part psychology. Plato's epithumia, thumos, and logistikon becomes, in the scholastic tradition, Latin-speaking tradition, the concupiscible, the irascible, and the rational parts of the soul. And hope is the theological virtue of the irascible part. The irascible attaches us firmly to what our reason has told us is the good to be pursued or done, the faciendum, regardless of any impediments. In a certain sense, it welcomes impediments. Aquinas says that the object of the irascible is a bonum arduum, a demanding good. And I think this is a brilliantly pithy characterization of the inner tension of this thumos, this irascible part. It attaches us resolutely to the good as good, but it also feels the appeal of the demanding as demanding. It can express itself in many ways, as dominating assertiveness, as masochistic asceticism, or as firm attachment to virtue. In conversations that Matt and I have carried on about these topics, I've begun to think of different human orders in terms of different thumatic economies. And you can see this as a kind of extension of Plato's regime analysis in Book 8 of the Republic, in terms of the kind of person who's held up as the target of honor in any given political order. The questions are, to what is our thumos directed and attached? In what form of channeling and expression? Within what imaginative horizon and rhetorical tonality? In the Christian thumatic economy, most broadly speaking, we are to attach this irascible part ultimately to the fullness of life promised by God, which is a life of the utmost love of God and neighbor, attainable in its most perfect degree only in eternal beatitude, but also available in life as we live it, to the degree that our hope directs us to that fullness, to the degree that we have faith in it, and in God's goodness manifested in the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection, as well as creation, and to the degree that we participate sacrificially in the love that is God's own act of being. In this regard, the asceticism of Christianity is not merely negative, but rather for the sake of an arduous good, and not an otherworldly or world-denying good, but one that vivifies us in life as we live it. Our thumos extends through life and its goods beyond death to an ultimate good. And this gives origin to a new word, relatively new. You almost never find it prior to St. Paul, which is macrothumia. Right? Which I like to translate as extended thumos. On this basis of this psychology, we can understand what Hobbes and Locke add to the Baconian vision to shape the thumatic economy of modern liberalism. Hobbes, in the famous 13th chapter of Leviathan, contrasts the three causes of quarrel with the three passions that incline to peace. And these are parallel triads, if you look closely. Competition for goods inclines to quarrel, while, quote, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living inclines to peace. Distrust and fear of one another leads to quarrel, while fear of death under the right conditions inclines to peace. Desire for glory, which is the irrational thumos of the aristocrat, causes quarrel. Hope to attain the means of commodious living by our industry, which is the oligarchic or bourgeois channel of thumos, inclines to peace. When we see the thumotic transposition underlying this last parallel, we can see that Hobbes has done something profound and complicated here. Hobbes recognizes, but ignores, the Christian insight that hope is a theological virtue of the irascible soul, one which displaces the pride in virtue that is characteristic of the honor-loving pagan aristocrat. Hobbes tethers thumos to the economic activity by which the common man can restlessly do his part in the relief of man's estate, underwritten by the Leviathan of the modern state who protects their gains as property. Hobbes thus advances the Baconian project by opening up its economic front. Locke takes this transposition for granted and transforms it into an object of hope on the global scale of Bacon's promise of relieving man's estate. The economics of growth is sustained by the Lockean principle of the rising tide of prosperity that lifts all boats, even the day laborers, as he says. The Baconian hope in itself is quite consistent with a vision of technocratic expert rule, as he shows in his New Atlantis. It is also consistent with the authoritarian state, as Hobbes shows in Leviathan. But the Lockean vision of man as maker of value and transformer of the world through his own labor, who thereby earns his prosperity, is a vision much more flattering to our thumos as acting beings. This rising tide optimism becomes the vision of liberal economics and the most visible defining feature of its thumotic economy. This rising tide of optimism is ultimately a mythological faith, insofar as it abstracts from the question of the actual resources of the earth upon which it is premised, right? That's just X that's input into the economic formulas. Insofar as it abstracts from this question, it can be plausibly described as an otherworldly faith, to a far greater degree than the Christian hope premised upon the actual superabundance of goods made available to us in God's created order. It is also a very powerful distraction. As long as growth economics does function as a rising tide, in some locations at least, and at least to the degree that it sustains hope that it can continue to function that way, then it distracts from the tension always present, according to classical political philosophy, between oligarchy and democracy, a tension that is hidden at the heart of the liberal project. It also distracts from the anxiety for control that is the offspring of the Baconian project of control. And the rising tide and the anxiety for control are two sedimented layers of distraction from the project of total control itself and its authoritarian or totalitarian tendencies. And finally, the aspiration to control is itself a distraction from the question of a life well lived and the goods constitutive of such a life. Though at this level, perhaps the word diversion or misdirection would be more accurate. Christian hope is not otherworldly in anything like this sense. It is based on two mutually reinforcing layers of faith. There is the faith that Matt has described, which recognizes the goodness of life and the world of goods that invigorate us. And there is the faith that Matt points toward in a God who has given not only this world of superabundant goods, but also the promise of a more complete communion and beatitude that is only the more absolute fullness of a communion and beatitude in which we are able to participate in the life and the world he has already given us. Optimism, in its Baconian Lockean as well as its Baconian Marxist forms, and in all the varieties of attempts to salvage these visions, is thus nihilistic in its transformative ambitions, which are antithetical to the faith that opens our eyes to the goodness of being. This optimism is always prepared to sacrifice actual goods of the world we inhabit for imaginary worlds of a good that does not exist. It is thus the characteristic modern form of Gnosticism, as Ratzinger recognized. Gnosticism is the first and most grandiose of conspiracy theories. The resentful, world-escaping religion that Nietzsche mistakenly confused Christianity with. The modern form of Gnosticism has a certain liability, however. It relies on the world as a resource or standing reserve that can be exploited to deliver on its aspiration to create another more perfect world. When the world shows signs of not cooperating, for example, since 2008, this optimism generates resentment as well as despair. But the optimists consider it both heretical and immoral to despair of their God of their faith. And so it becomes necessary to dissemble this condition by turning resentment into the channel of wrathful denunciation of those who could be blamed for standing in the way of getting there. I'll close with St. Paul's audacious expression of the hope and faith that steadies the Christian amid all disappointment, disaster, cataclysm, what have you. We know that for those who love God and who heed the call of his will, all things work together for the good. As Matt's reflections suggest, this is not the expression of wishful thinking, but an empirical observation. Thank you.
In the longer version of his paper, the political philosopher Matthew Crawford illuminated a number of challenges that afflict our contemporary culture. Among them, he decried the modern attitude to reality, which tacitly posits that we have no access to it except as we shape it ourselves, resulting in epistemic anxiety that leads to an imperative of control. This metaphysics of human plasticity, as Crawford terms it, has political consequences, insofar as it tends to reduce human beings to raw material to be manipulated by those in power by means of propaganda, pharmacology, or social media algorithms. How might we escape this conundrum? Do we need to reject modernity wholesale and retreat to pre-modernity? At first glance, the answer appears to be no. We do not need to reject modernity and all the quality of life improvements that science and technology have given us. We only need to forestall evil human actions by invoking universal moral principles accessible to human reason, such as those proposed by everyone's favorite rationalist philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Kant's foundational moral principle, the categorical imperative, ethically constrains us from treating other human beings as mere means to advance our own ends, on the grounds that using one's own rational freedom to hinder or destroy someone else's rational freedom would amount to a rational contradiction. But this proposed solution has at least two obvious flaws. First, not everyone ascribes to Kant's moral philosophy. As the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre argued in his book After Virtue, non-teleological accounts of morality ultimately collapse, because once reason is severed completely from desire, from one's internal motivation to pursue certain ends, then even the internal summons to obey one's own reason becomes weakened to the point of impotence. Why should I be moral? Why should I obey the categorical imperative rather than my own selfish desire to acquire power over other people so that I can oppress them, use them, or manipulate them for my own purposes? Secondly, even if one does choose to live as a thoroughgoing Kantian, always respecting other people's freedom to pursue their own ends and never treating them as a mere means, this ethical stance, good as it is, noble as it is, would not suffice to eliminate one's own epistemic anxiety. Anxiety rooted in the belief that the noumenal world, reality as it exists in itself, is simply inaccessible to human reason, thus condemning us to a world in which the only thing meaningful is that which we ourselves produce by our own efforts. Not a bad world, but not a deeply meaningful one either, because all human creations are fleeting and ephemeral, and as such cannot give rise to a deep and abiding joy. And this is precisely where pre-modernity, in its metaphysical confidence that reality can be known, offers a salutary corrective to our current existential angst. And not just pre-modernity in general, but the Christian pre-modern worldview in particular yields a superior alternative to our contemporary malaise, to that sterile repetition of producing and consuming, constructing and destructing, bereft of any objectively discernible signposts to authentic human flourishing. Crawford already rehearsed a few salient points made by the Christian theologian Joseph Ratzinger. I will supplement this with insights from the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas. In Aquinas' metaphysics, being and goodness are convertible. Insofar as something has being, insofar as something has been created by God and is sustained in its existence by God, it is good. Genesis 1:31, God looked at everything he had made and found it very good. Furthermore, because God is pure act, actus purus, the very act of being, when a creature's being is actualized as it moves from potency to act, it becomes even more good. Accordingly, human beings who are created in God's own image and likeness are good simply by virtue of existing, but they become even more good to the extent that they actualize their being. Actualization, becoming good in the fullest possible sense, involves using their natural God-given capacities, especially reason and will, in cooperation with God's grace to develop a wide range of virtues. These virtues predispose the person to perform good acts, especially acts of love directed toward both God and one's neighbor. Notably, the moral exemplar in this process, the person who reliably embodies and pedagogically demonstrates virtuous living, is neither the wise man of Aristotle's Polis, nor the wise sage whom Stoic philosophers like Epictetus identified as Socrates, but rather the first-century Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, whom Christians identify as the second member of the Trinity, the divine Logos, the Word, who took on a human nature for the sake of human salvation. Jesus reliably shows us our telos, what authentic human fulfillment looks like, because he is not only true God, but also a fully actualized and perfected human being. As the Second Vatican Council puts it, quote, Jesus is Christ, the final Adam, who fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear, unquote. Aquinas, like all Christian theologians, thus looks to Jesus to clarify how to live virtuously and how to attain the greatest fulfillment possible in this earthly life, even while we remain vulnerable to physical suffering like pain, injury, disease, or disabilities, spiritual suffering like sadness, heartbreak, betrayal, loneliness, and rejection, and the frustration that naturally arises when our well-intentioned attempts to eradicate injustice in our society, a seemingly surefire path to provide meaning and transcendent purpose in our lives, falls short of our expectations, a frustration that easily can harden into cynicism, resentment, or even bitterness. While we can and should work to create a more just world by improving social conditions so as to maximize human flourishing, we also must remain cognizant of the limits of such projects, not just limits to natural resources or limits to human creativity and ingenuity, but also limits to human goodness. After all, we are rational beings endowed with freedom, who easily can be tempted to misuse our freedom for evil purposes, such as self-aggrandizement at others' expense. For this reason, we never will be able to develop and marshal our scientific and technological resources to create a world that is largely devoid of suffering, like the one that the Enlightenment philosopher John Stuart Mill aspired to attain in his book Utilitarianism. As Shakespeare's Julius Caesar pithily observed, the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. This lamentable but persistent feature of human affairs, which Christians refer to as original sin, implies that the fundamental core of human malaise, anxiety, emptiness, boredom, and radical dissatisfaction lies not in the seemingly slow time it takes to charge my Android phone, which hopefully will be fixed in the next generation of quick chargers, but in the mistaken pursuit of such technological innovations as my summum bonum, as my highest good. Although not a Christian, the ancient philosopher Aristotle accurately discerned that the typical things we human beings seek to attain, wealth, honor, power, and pleasure, never can fulfill us. For even when we possess ample amounts of them, we remain unsatisfied. Only a life of virtue, coupled with a moderate amount of external goods, can bring us happiness. Aristotle certainly would acknowledge that science and technology play an indispensable secondary role by maximizing human access to the external goods necessary for basic human flourishing. But the core of human happiness only can be attained by living virtuously. Aquinas' own account of virtue improves upon Aristotle in several respects. Cognizant of the human propensity to sin, Aquinas recognizes the need for both, one, cooperation with God's grace to heal our own sinful tendencies, and two, a certain modicum of detachment from other people's sinful behavior. Not by cultivating stoic apatheia, which would counsel us to avoid disappointment by suppressing all natural human emotion, but by keeping our eyes fixed on God and the saints, expanding our perception to grasp the fullness of reality in its overarching beauty and intrinsic goodness, rather than fixating our attention on one small corner of darkness and despair. Illumined by this broader vision, we learn that the essence of God and the ultimate meaning of reality is love. In the Christian worldview, God is not a single person who possesses the rational capacities of intelligence and free will, but a trinity, a communion of three persons united eternally in love. We humans are called to imitate God by similarly cultivating a communion of persons rooted in the love of friendship. And therein lies the path to experience transcendent meaning and authentic joy, even amidst suffering. The Second Vatican Council declared accordingly that the human being, quote, the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself, unquote. By looking to Jesus as the embodied telos rather than to the wise man of Aristotle's polis, we also acquire a corrected set of the virtues requisite for authentic human fulfillment. The most important virtue is caritas, our love for God and our neighbor in God. But another important, though underappreciated virtue is that of gratitude. Defined narrowly, gratitude involves giving thanks to benefactors who bestow favors upon us freely, without their being obliged to do so. But more broadly, we are called to give thanks to everyone who bestows gifts on us that are unmerited. For example, we owe worship and reverence, which Aquinas terms piety, to our parents who birthed us and to our country which nourished us. Above all, we should honor, revere, and give thanks to God, who is our unfailing principle and last end. Not for God's sake, but for our own, because by subjecting our mind to God, who is ultimate truth, our mind is perfected. Aquinas therefore would agree with Crawford's intuition that gratitude for the giftedness of our existence can liberate us from that joyless triad of resentment, entitlement, and grievance that pervades our contemporary milieu. Thank you.
I'm going to admit I've never really read Thomas, so I've got some homework to do. And Mark, this is something you've mentioned before, that for Thomas, hope is connected to the irascible, the thumatic. And I find that really arresting. So just to see if I can sort of recapitulate it, the irascible part of the soul, that the spirited, the part that's sort of prone to get angry, including angry at oneself. You're trying to sort of overcome your own lameness. That this attaches us to the good regardless of obstacles, and maybe even welcomes them, because then it's the sort of exercise of that thumatic capacity. Yeah. And that that seems like it's kind of akin to I mean, just in very banal terms, like having a taste for effort. And including, so you talk about the bonum arduum, the arduous good, the goods that are, the pursuit of which is not, it's not sort of, there's no easy pleasure in the pursuit. It's a sort of a hierarchy of good. So these are ones that are, there's some pain involved in achieving.
Yeah, which partly you described in terms of that erotic gap, right?
Yeah, right. A sense of the distance between yourself, at least your current self, and some good that you're called toward. So that's right. That makes hope and thumos appear as the opposite of ressentiment. So my treatment of ressentiment, I use the French word because that's what Nietzsche did, and most people sort of follow his treatment. So there's a guy named Max Scheler, another German philosopher, who has a beautiful little book called Ressentiment. In fact, we're having a seminar tomorrow to talk about it. So he has that insight that one manifestation of ressentiment is to say that all values are merely subjective. There's nothing truly higher that stands in judgment of my own capacities. And based on your remarks, I can now see that the opposite of ressentiment is a kind of thumotic. Can you say a little more on how Thomas understands hope in that way? I mean, you did it, but just do it again.
Well, do you want to
Sure.
Yeah.
So for Aquinas, the virtue of hope, like faith and charity, they're what's called theological virtues. So they direct us directly to God. So because he sees beatitude, our state in heaven as where our ultimate happiness lies, beyond the natural happiness of this world. And beatitude is knowing God and loving God. So our intellect is at rest because it knows ultimate truth, and our will is at rest because it knows ultimate good. It experiences ultimate good. And that love of God is the love of friendship, where you enjoy just being with God. So faith, hope, and charity are all directing the person to their ultimate fulfillment of knowing and loving God in the beatific vision. And so as part of that hope, you could talk about just the mere passion of hope, which is directed toward goods that are difficult to obtain. Like if a dog is jumping up trying to get at a steak that's hanging from a tree and he thinks, I'm going to get that steak, that's the passion of hope. If he gives up at some point and falls into despair because it's too difficult, he gives up. But the theological virtue of hope, which is oriented toward God, is in between the vices of basically too little and too much in the Aristotelian trajectory of the Goldilocks form. So it's between presumption, where you trust that no matter how you live your life, you're going to end up knowing and loving God in the end, and despair, where you just think no matter that you'll never get there. So instead, hope is about trusting God, that God will give you the help you need to attain that final end.
Yeah, and then that's very helpful. And I'll add to that. Melanie brought up Stoic apatheia, right? Which is sort of a right. Stoicism is sort of what you get when pagan thumos philosophizes by itself, and it's this imperviousness, right, to whatever happens. That's a kind of image of what Christian hope gives you, right? But in Christian hope, it's not pure detachment, right? There's a love of the good, but also a love of the good within the horizon of the ultimate good, and an awareness that there's always loss, there's always evil, right? that love and attachment is not the ultimate attachment, right?
So it sounds like it's kind of living in the, I don't know, you could call it tragically inevitable kind of gap between ourselves and the good rather than becoming insensitive to the goodness of the good,
Right.
which is what apatheia maybe is.
But what allows you to live in the gap and exist there is the fact that you're trusting in God. So you're getting the help and the trust that God will help you beyond what you yourself are capable of. So there's a realism there that you're not just optimistically trusting in something that might never happen.
Through grace.
Through grace, yeah.
Shall we open it up?
Yeah,
Go
I'll just throw one other interesting contrast out. This was developed in a talk that R.J. Snell gave that I thought was pretty fascinating. He wrote a book on sloth, right, achadia, which is it's a bit different from there's listlessness, which is just like I can't rouse myself up to do anything difficult, right? But achadia kind of is more in the spiritual dimension of despondency, right? That what's the point, right? And it's kind of a giving up on the good that is God, and on my own call toward God and toward my own vocation, which is to be what God wants me to be, right? And in the kind of opposite of that is a sort of magnanimity of the Christian assurance, right? That I do have a vocation. There is something that God wants me to be. It is going to be difficult, but it is what is good for me and for everyone around, that I have anything to do with.
Yeah, and you pointed out towards the end that asceticism in this Christian version is not merely negative, nor is it otherworldly, but vivifying in the way that you just kind of indicated, I think.
So we've mentioned faith and hope. I'm just wondering if we could, if invitation to comment a bit on love a bit. So, and especially Ratzinger, right, as Benedict XVI, we talked about Spe Salvi, but his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est. One of the things that struck me is that he comments about how even if he hypothesizes, even if the modern project of a utopia succeeded, it wouldn't be sufficient because man still needs love. So if you could comment on this timidity and the sort of epistemological foundations we've talked about that kind of lead us towards a technocracy and maybe a sort of Gnosticism, implications that might have with our need for love and why we see so much or not enough, perhaps, of love in modernity.
Well, yeah, you started on that topic.
No, we'll have minutes.
Well, last night I gave a talk downtown, and we had some discussion of a little bit towards the end about love. So a friend of our Mark and I, Adrian Walker, offered the idea that technocracy is sort of an aspiration to control without love, and usually what that requires is some kind of systematization. And to systematize, you have to sort of abstract from particulars. And it's usually closer to the particulars that something is lovable. I mean, once you kind of go up to the sort of meta levels, you're dealing in abstractions. So I think that's a thought that's worth pursuing, that that there's a kind of lovelessness to technocracy. But I also want to insist that there is a sense of technology, I don't want to use that word, of techne, of skill, artisanship, craftsmanship, that is in more intimate contact with the material, that is itself only successful with love. In other words, the artisan has to go deep into the particular objects that he's concerned with, and they become an object of passionate concern, and that's how you become really good at something, which is very different from technocracy, I think.
I would add too, in the Christian understanding, God is love. We're made in the image of God, so we're made for love. We can only find our true fulfillment in love. But what does love look like? It's not just about having a positive sentiment to someone. It's about actively willing their good. and perhaps even at the point of giving up something of yourself and some suffering, potentially for the sake of the good of the other. So the virtue of charity is about loving God first and then loving your neighbor in God, meaning you want for your neighbor all the things that God wants for them. So I would say in our contemporary culture, one of the things that maybe pervades it and leads to a lot of the dissatisfaction is the pornified culture, which is really a reversal of that, because in the pornography medium, people end up trying to create reality through images and activities where they're not really experiencing a real person in the fullness of who they are, body and soul, their hopes, their dreams, what they're about. They're just abstracting from that and turning them into a thing and then using them for their own purposes. And the more someone habituates themselves to that mindset, then when they enter into a real relationship with a real person, now they've been formed to treat that person as an object rather than be able to receive the fullness of who they are. And so I would say that's part of why there's so much joy that's missing. And people can't find that deeper level of fulfillment because they've malformed themselves to relate to other people as objects. So the same attitude that you can see in various kinds of technocracy relating to the world in terms of things to be used for my own purposes also enters into the relational dimension and similarly leads to that anxiety and malaise.
Yeah, and then one thing I'd add to that, and this came up in the conversation last night too, you see this in our, for the most part, the way we approach education, right? Our approach to education really is a kind of technocratic, I want to make sure that my kids are maximally prepared for potentially whatever it is that they can do at the highest level, right? As opposed to, who is this child of mine? What's their good, right? There's there's some forms of education that you can find out there that that allow that approach, but it's not typical.
Yeah, there's a kind of love is connected to attention, right? In fact, you could say attention is a kind of love, because the question of what to attend to, since you have a finite amount of it, is the question of what to value, what's actually going to be present to you. And Mark, you were just talking about a kind of attention to one's kid in their particularity that is, loving attention.
As opposed to just handing them over to the system in
right.
Anxiety, right?
Yeah, right.
I just wanted to ask a sort of a follow-up question on the comparison between sort of technocracy and techne, and what you said about how techne or craft, when done right, has some deep relationship with love with respect to the object over which it presides. But techne also has this sense that it can have a kind of neutrality with respect to the end towards which it's directed. And we hear people when they talk about technology at times, we hear this thing like, technology is not bad, it depends how you use it. So what it's aimed at. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about like the way in which the techne gets used in the right way. Is that something internal to techne, or is it something that's applied? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, I think, I had that quote from Oppenheimer, right? That when you see something that's technically sweet, you do it. So there are goods that are internal to some technical practice or some, some sort of discipline of inquiry, such as physics, that offer certain satisfactions. But then one has to have a meta reflection about the end served by the particular technical thing. So when I was just saying that the objects of the skill become objects of love, that's not sufficient to have a kind of ethics of technology, right? Because maybe those objects, you're really good at bomb making or something. In my book, The World Beyond Your Head, I present this extended case study of these guys who build Baroque pipe organs. And so they're technicians. They're engaged in this sort of loving quarrel, at times contentious, with the tradition. I mean, they also service pipe organs built 400 years ago. You know, they travel around to tune them up and stuff, and investigate how the old masters made them, and they build their own organs with the intention that they'll still be in service 400 years from now. I mean, it's extraordinary trade that they're in. And one of the things that was really appealing about it, I was reading a lot of McIntyre when I was visiting this place over the course of months, is that, and McIntyre has this idea of goods internal to a practice as opposed to sort of extrinsic rewards that you might seek through the practice, like money or prestige or whatever. But with these organ makers, the end served by their skill as craftsmen is musicality. There has to be a good instrument, and being a good instrument is in the service of the organ repertoire is usually church music. And of course the organ repertoire is in the service of the life of the congregation, and it's a music of praise of God. So there's sort of this nestled order where each layer points beyond itself to a more comprehensive good. And that, I don't know how many cases one could find of a technical practice that is so embedded in that way. Maybe that's not generalizable, but it's certainly an appealing picture of a life as a craftsman that would be, ordered to the good ultimately, and very appealing.